My name is Randall Eggert. This class is Grammar and Stylistics. It's about writing clearly.
This is the first of a series of 2 videos on concision. In this one, we're going to be focusing on Joseph Williams' principles of concision. But before we launch into those, I want to get into my own principles. The first is that concise does not equal short. That a long sentence can be concise and a short sentence can be wordy. Also, that a passage of any length, so a sentence, a paragraph, a section, or a paper, is concise insofar as it expresses a maximum of information with a minimum of words. All right, now Williams' principles are as follows. Delete words that mean little or nothing. Delete words that repeat the meaning of other words. Delete words whose meaning a reader can infer. Replace a phrase with a word, and change negatives to affirmatives. I'll be going over the first 3 in more depth. The final 2, I think, are fairly self-explanatory. The first one, replace a phrase with a word. The principle here is that if you've got 2 alternatives that mean the same thing, whereas one has, say, 2 words and the other has 1 word, opt for the 1 word. Always opt for the less wordy option when you've got alternatives. The other is to change negatives to affirmatives. So negatives inherently have an extra word, not, but they also are psychologically less concise, which means that they just require more brain processing than affirmatives. All right, so number 1, delete words that mean little or nothing. Williams introduces this term verbal tick. When we speak, we need words to give ourselves time to collect our thoughts and to let our audience know that we're not giving up our term. We're still talking. So the most obvious word in English would be or Other languages have other ones. Like French, for example, you say Every language seems to have these pause words to let our audience know that we are still talking, but we're in the process of collecting our thoughts. Now, when we're in a more formal situation, we will probably choose more formal pause words. In informal language, we have other ones like kind of, or like, or, you know. In more formal speeches, impromptu speeches, or lectures in college classes, your professors will probably use ones like actually, or particularly, really, certain, various, virtually, individual, basically, generally, given, practically. And in fact, you can probably identify for each of your professors what their tics are. I get very self-conscious as I do this lecture because I start thinking about my own tics. One of them is right or okay. These are just ways that I've got to keep myself talking. Now, what happens is that when we write, those same tics come out unconsciously, and they should be unconscious. As you're drafting, please don't think about this. As you're speaking, don't think about it, because if you get too self-conscious, you'll get tongue-tied, or as you're writing, you'll get finger-tied, and you won't know how to keep going. I once listened to Brett Lott, who's a really great novelist, talking about this, that he became conscious that he tends to begin sentences with then, and he tried to stop himself from doing that, and he found that he got writer's block. So now he just lets himself begin every sentence as he's drafting with then, and he said it works really great because it just keeps him writing. And then when he's done, he uses search and replace and just gets rid of every then that's not useful. For me, I do this with actually. I find I use actually a lot in my writing, and it's rarely useful. It is occasionally, but most of the time I can just get rid of them. Other words that I think you can usually get rid of, maybe 99% of the time, are emphasizing adverbs. You don't have to tell your audience that something is very important. If it's important, let it say so for itself. Let the ideas stand for themselves. You don't have to inflate your ideas. And in fact, it usually works the opposite. Then when a reader feels like you're inflating things, then they start getting suspicious. Another one is delete words that repeat the meaning of other words. This is his number 2 principle. Repetitive phrases. Again, I think this comes from speaking, that when we speak, we're generally doing it in real time, and our audience has to process it as we're speaking, which means that if they miss a word that's important, they may totally misunderstand what we're saying. And so then we get expressions like each and every to emphasize that wholeness of it, that everyness of it. Well, with writing, we've got the luxury of time, both with writing and with reading. Our readers can go back and reread something if they miss a word. You can't do that with speaking, but you can with writing, which means we don't need these repetitive phrases or redundant phrases like completely finished, past history, various different, basic fundamentals. My least favorite of these is free gift. I hate it when people tell me that they're going to give me a free gift. You don't need those. Just say finish. Just say history. Just say gift. And then we've got redundant categories like large in size. Well, what else would it be large in? Round in shape, honest in character, unusual in nature. Just say large. Just say round. Just say honest. We can also delete words whose meaning a reader can infer. And I've emphasized this in a lot of my videos, that you need to know your audience. That's an essential part of any writing. And sometimes you may need to create an ideal reader. But the point is that you need to know enough about your audience to know what you can trust them to infer. You can trust an educated adult to understand a lot more than a 5th grader does. So you can leave a lot more words out. You can trust that they know certain background knowledge, and you can leave that out. You don't have to state everything. There's a special category of this that Williams refers to as meta-discourse. Meta is when we talk about things. So meta-language is language about language. Meta-discourse is discourse about discourse. It describes what we're doing as we're writing the paper. So for example, belief statements. I believe, I think, in my opinion. Most of the time you can leave those off because readers will infer it. They understand that if you say something, you're saying it because you believe it. I would argue that the only time we really need to put in something like this, like in my opinion, is when you're contrasting your opinion with somebody else's. So if you have just spent the last 2 paragraphs summarizing somebody else's ideas, that might make a good transition to say, in my opinion, and now the reader knows, okay, now we're moving away from that person's ideas to the writer's ideas. But most of the time, it's just assumed that if you say something, you say it because you believe it. Descriptions of textual moves is another sort of meta-discourse. Words like, for example, in conclusion, we will consider such arguments in section 3. These are moves describing what we're doing. They can be very useful at times. So it guides the reader to what we're doing. Sometimes a writer may include an entire paragraph where they talk about what they're going to do in the paper. I think of that as a roadmap to the paper. It's perhaps not necessary, but it can be useful. And part of what your job as a writer is to figure out when does a reader need that sort of guidance and when don't they? And again, that gets back to knowing your audience. Connectors as well are a type of meta-discourse. They tell a reader how one idea is relevant to another. Now, and is probably the broadest one, and probably in a lot of ways the least meaningful, because all it's saying is these 2 ideas are true and they're somehow related, but gives us a little more information. that one is surprising given the other. However, likewise does that. Those can be, I think, extremely useful from a reader's point of view, because whenever something is surprising, that tells me it's important. Therefore is also useful because it tells the audience that a conclusion is coming. Now, you don't always have to throw those in. They're not going to always be necessary. Use them sparingly, and then they're going to be more effective. The final type of meta-discourse is what Williams calls autobiography. I'm going to read this passage for you. The bulk of this presentation was written while holed up in a small posada in the south of Portugal, not far from the town of Sagres, where Henry the Navigator had established his famous school of navigation and exploration. I learned while I was down there that the navigator himself wasn't much of a traveler, and in fact never made beyond Tangier, just across the border. Partially as a result of this paper and a nasty bug caught in Lisbon, I never even made it that far. Now, this is the first paragraph of a paper from a conference proceedings. So a friend of mine presented this paper to the proceedings, then sent in the paper to the organizers for the proceedings. Now, I challenge you to figure out what the paper was about from this first paragraph. I do this in my face-to-face classes, and nobody can get even close. So I'll give it away. The paper was about linguistic evolution. This first paragraph has nothing to do with linguistic evolution. It has everything to do with the writer. It's autobiography. It's about the writer writing about the process of writing this paper. And I find that writers will often do this in their drafts. They'll talk about the process of writing it. They'll talk about something that happened to them in 5th grade that made them interested in the topic that they're writing about now. And I can see how that could be really useful, because a blank page is daunting. And if you can fill up that page and get yourself started, the rest gets easier and easier. And I think that's what the writer of this one was doing, was just getting themselves started. But what they should have done was just gone through and deleted that whole paragraph before they submitted it, because it's worthless. Just like that story about 5th grade is worthless. Reader doesn't care. Other sorts of meta-discourse are about the false starts that you might have done. So I often get that in drafts where a writer will tell me about how they thought that they were going to argue one thing and they hit a roadblock and they ended up writing about something else. I don't care. I want to know what you ended up writing about. I want to know your argument for this paper, not some other hypothetical paper. I get this in primary research, where a researcher will talk about the failed experiments that they did before they found the experiment that actually worked. It doesn't matter. All I care about is the argument and how that experiment leads us to better insight about the world. The fact is, writing is a process, and a reader doesn't need access to that process. All they need is the final product. And all those false starts that you did initially, the reader doesn't need to know about.